Welcome to the Capital Compass, the podcast to help navigate your journey to value. I'm your host, Susan Edwards, and today we're diving into total cost of ownership. It's a topic that's reshaping how health systems approach capital strategy. Joining me today is Danny Cisneros from Vizient's Capital Equipment Solutions team. Danny will break down how lifecycle view of capital equipment beyond the purchase price can unlock cost savings, strategic alignment, and long-term value. Danny, thanks so much for being in the studio with us today. We are super excited to have you in this edition of the Capital Compass podcast. Let's talk about total cost of ownership.
Yeah. It is something that healthcare institutions are not as focused on as they actually should be. A lot of healthcare institutions don't understand that just a purchase from a national level or just what they're getting is less than actually 50% of the entire purchase. It really needs to be looked at over a course of time and with other factors involved. You know, you'll have a lot of healthcare institutions that they're like, well, we connected with the supplier, we got the need met. It was good. We think we got a good price based off of some erroneous data point that they didn't know was flawed. We've checked the box, and it often is the wrong way to go about it.
So how long do you think it has been since healthcare organizations have started changing their approach to uncover and unveil that total cost elements?
What's interesting, because it started 10 years ago now, where a lot of healthcare institutions started connecting with supplier community in a different way. They started asking different questions because about 10 years ago, there was a big flux in the market where suppliers or vendors, however you want to label them, were going to members with package deals. And there were a couple of healthcare institutions that actually started pushing back on that. And then that movement started to grow within the healthcare space. And then as it was moving that way, we actually at Vizient got a lot of additional calls to our category managers, what was then called portfolio executives, of members kind of reaching out and saying, hey, can we dive a little bit deeper into capital? Can you help us dive in a little bit more into capital? At the time, the capital team was not set up to answer that call. We are now. COVID really accelerated that conversation in a big, big way because people were looking at their logistics warehouse. They were looking at what they had within their institution for a couple of different categories of equipment that was really aiding the COVID pandemic. They were finding things in nooks and crannies and on floors that they were like, what is this piece of equipment? As they were looking to solve for ventilators and stuff like that. Why do we have all these Bovie machines? Like, what are these waste fluid management devices that are kind of here? Do we need this stuff? And so as they were asking those questions, they kept them in the back of their head. Well, fast forward, we've dealt with the pandemic. And now they're like, okay, so let's revisit this conversation.
As other companies out in the marketplace have started bundling services, we're now unbundling to really get down into what that total cost looks like.
Yeah. Long gone is the day where physicians come to you and say, hey, look, my piece of equipment is broken. I really need it in order to provide patient care today. That's kind of going away because as systems look for a way to increase their margins, they're looking at how to purchase these big pieces of capital equipment in a smarter, more efficient way. They're trying to get away from that. They're trying to get into standardization, not only with specific vendors, but specific configurations of types of equipment because it has this downstream effect. That's kind of where we're at today.
Let's talk about that downstream effect, or rather, let's take it upstream. Let's talk about how the concept of total cost of ownership impacts service line expansion, strategies, the maintenance, the life cycle components of ownership. So how does that all kind of come back together?
I'm going to take you through the dark forest and bring you into the Shire here, okay? And an example. We had a health system that came to us that was looking to do things in a better way. And the system came to us and we had an initiative that we started with them for point of care ultrasounds. They were utilizing, I don't know, I think the tune of the suppliers was like 15, 14 in that space. It was a lot. And we were sort of sifting through that information, and we were working with the clinicians and all these different folks. And we really started to uncover that, hey, there were challenges with clinical staff really understanding whenever they went over to this site, like they were supposed to use this ultrasound. Whenever they went over to this site, they were supposed to use that ultrasound. And that's a lot of back-end training. I would imagine if we were on the floor, we would probably hear things like, well, I use this one over here. Why is that specific A supplier not over here? And so there was probably a lot of scuttlebutt on the floor too, like, hey, this really isn't efficient. This isn't great. And then, of course, that reaches up to your physicians, and the physicians are like, hey, how come my PA is using this over here and not over here? Now I want supplier A over here, and it just gets this hodgepodge of different supplier mix. Well, without somebody being able to really look at all that information, they were in no man's land. So what we did was we went through and looked at a hefty data set and decided that if you guys are standardizing these products, not only the configurations across multiple hospitals, but if you're decreasing the vendor market size within your institution, you're going to have a lot more purchasing power. You're going to be able to look at things like upgrades more efficiently. And additionally, they had a couple of sites that they were building, and it was like, hey, look, if this is that downstream effect that we're talking, right? We're salmon swimming upstream at this point. And so just fighting against that traditional sort of school of thought.
Sure, that happens in all healthcare organizations, right? Trying to change the status quo and turn the large ships in a slow, steady pace, making the corner can be a challenge.
Right. So the metaphor is appropriate, right? As we were doing that, they started seeing there's clinical applications to this too. We actually don't need as many, because we're more focused on the upgrades. We're more focused on being able to get the equipment in the facilities and have clinicians training on it, so we're actually able to see patients faster. We're actually able to pull more patients through the system, and we're actually able to take care of them in a more systematic way. There was a big downstream effect. They were able to see more patients. Their physicians were able to bring more on site to those hospitals rather than competing hospitals in the area, because that's a big problem for healthcare. Is you've got one physician and he is doing multiple surgeries or multiple procedures at 4 different hospitals. Scheduling gets really tricky for those folks. So you really want them to bring everything that you can at one mothership, one hospital situation. And clinicians are that way too. I really don't typically want to take my patients to Hospital North and Hospital South. I would rather just take them to Hospital North. On the back end of that, for their business office, that's an administrative nightmare as well, sending doc to and from. So there was a lot of downstream effect on creating some systemness, creating some strategy. And then plus it helped out the supplier in that space. We were able to get from 14, 15 down to like 4, which was huge.
That's amazing.
That's huge.
How much money is that?
How much money did we save them?
Yeah.
To the tune of about $18 million.
That's a big number. And when you consider average margins are 3%, that's a significant amount of money.
You can buy a couple additional things at the hospital with $18 million.
Yeah, that's huge. Tell me about how you and your team approaches these scenarios with healthcare systems and hospitals and are able to bring in all of the different people involved in the decision making. To me, everything that you just described, I've worked in hospitals for 20 years, and I know how hard it is to operate on normal things. So when you're talking about a project that encompasses strategic positions, clinical care, finance, budgeting, the more hands in that, the more complicated it gets. So help our listeners understand what the Capital Equipment Solutions team does to begin that process of helping turn that ship into a total cost of ownership perspective.
I'm going to give you an example of something that probably most people here are familiar with, which is a board game. Think about playing Monopoly, but just not having any of the instructions, right? If you're somebody that's never played Monopoly and you just opened up the box and you're like, okay, I've got a board, I've got some cards, what's the money deal? That is often what we go into. Very complex board game without instructions. So we go in and we understand now there's some fundamental pillars in which we look to create some cohesion. Clinical, supply chain, and finance. Those are like the three that we have to do a system map. Who is in charge of this? What exactly are they in charge of? Just at a high level. And then we're going to go one step further. Now that we know who's in charge, what exactly projects are they in charge of? Sometimes there's some overlap in that piece where you really think that at a typical institution, a supply chain for procurement and medical should be involved in a rental for beds or stretchers, but realistically it's over in finance. And you're like, okay,
Sure.
So that's weird, but you have to map that.
We've talked about the total cost of ownership and how that is a result of COVID situations and how organizations are unbundling these large packages that they were once purchasing. Help us understand how that unbundling has allowed your team to get into the weeds of the life cycle and the impacts of the equipment life cycles and what those costs underneath those look like.
So I would say that looking at TCO for different healthcare organizations look differently. It really just depends on the maturity of that supply chain department and if they have finance backing, how close they work with that team, what is involvement, engagement, and ultimately somebody within their organization in that higher level like championing. How much do they champion effectively? Because what we find is most organizations have a TCO plan. It's a year. And it's like, that's not total cost of ownership. That's just ownership. That's a drop in the bucket. What we find is beneficial is sort of unbundling that. You get to take all the additional stuff off, and then you look at it from 3, 5, 7 years down the line. That's really where total cost of ownership is. And that's just the first step of the TCO. You got to think a lot further on down the line with consumables, service, technology, what is all that going to be included in sort of this? But you can't do that for a year. I mean, it's a drop in a bucket. Most capital equipment, the lifespan of equipment is anywhere from 12 to 15 years. If you go to AHA and look at sort of those guidelines, most of the suppliers have a input in what those replacement cycles are. And they usually say 5 to 6 years, but I've never been to a hospital where a sterilizer has been replaced in 5 to 6 years. So that's appropriate.
In the stages of the processes that you just described, where do you think we have the most untapped potential in terms of those steps and really looking into where costs are hiding?
So my favorite place to be within replacement for capital equipment is, and this is the sweet spot, this is right where I want to be, is in the middle of a budget cycle, starting a new budget cycle for the institution and a new build. That is perfect. You know, that is the Twinkie in the apocalypse, right? Like, even if they just negotiated something, they negotiated that price based off of what is currently within the system. And honestly, most of our systems don't have a great data depository, or the health of their capital equipment is not awesome. There is a large data desert for most of our health systems in regards to capital equipment. The way they forecast and provide savings or even identify savings is like not great in this space, because whenever you're looking at capital equipment, your data is from like 5 years ago. It's like, I negotiated an anesthesia machine 5 years ago, so I'm going to take that. I can't even buy a loaf of bread for what I could 5 years ago.
The fact that you're working with finance strategy, clinical outcomes, medical record systems, all those different things. If you were going to give some advice to an organization that was curious about their overall asset picture, what would you give them to do in steps 1, 2, and 3, knowing that there's data deserts out there, but they still have an end goal to better understand their capital?
There are 2 data systems that I would say, at least for the acute space, they've probably got 2 data systems that are housing a lot of their capital data. Separately, they have 2 segments of the same picture. Now, putting them together is sort of key. It's really wherever they're keeping their budgeting their requisitions, their orders, things like that is in one system. And that's typically people in finance are typically responsible for that. They usually own that. They have usually formed some sort of agreement with a supplier to house that on a platform. And then there is a biomed or a clinical engineering database as well that shares the other half of that picture. Now, in most situations, that's great. We've got two different softwares. It's completing the picture. But if you don't have a place to put those two things together, then you don't have a clear picture of your capital equipment. It's important to be able to marry those two data sets to be able to forecast your capital equipment properly. Most suppliers in the space will actually create a module or develop something for a healthcare organization to marry those two.
Why do you think the ASC needs versus the acute care needs are so inherently different when the outcomes of what they're looking for or ultimately trying to accomplish are the same?
Well, I think volume is an issue. I mean, your ASCs are not going to be replacing as much capital every year. There's going to be largely different budgets that are going to be associated. So they don't have as much buying power. Secondly, a lot of ASCs are sometimes managed, owned, and operated by a physician board. They've got some vesting interest in the ASC market. And then really it's just whoever is bringing in the most revenue to the ASC sort of gets their new shiny thing. The orthopod gets his brand new lights, columns, and boom system while the pain management guy is still operating on the same OR table that they've been operating on for the last 10 years.
Gotcha. When we opened up this conversation, you gave an example that rendered some large dollars in savings. So let's talk about some real examples that you've had to step into. Maybe describe kind of what that call to action, what that need was when they called you and said, hey, we need some help. Can you take a look at? Just kind of tell that story.
Sure. So we had a member come to us and they were like, hey, our supply chain needs help. We have never looked at capital in a different way other than spot buys. We get a requisition. We throw this requisition in a pot and we pick out what we believe is the appropriate capital equipment to do. So there's a capital budget of like $50 million. We're just going to try to get as many of the items in this as possible to say we're making an impact on their fleet. And then when you ask them the question, like, well, what sort of impact? How much of your fleet did you turn over? They're like, well, we don't know, but we replaced more than we could have. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that's good, I guess. You are making an impact. You can't tell me what it is, but you're making one. We had a healthcare organization come to us and they said, how can you help us here? We don't have a specific focus on capital. So because we don't have a specific focus on capital, we've kind of kicked the ball around a couple of times to a couple of different people and no one had a strategy. Like, help us make a strategy. And so we came into the institution and the first thing we did was we were like, so where's the data for all your capital equipment? And they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, what do you mean what I mean? And they're like, well, no, we don't have it by department. We just have it. Here at this hospital, you have 3. And they were like, well, yeah, I mean, each one has its own depository of data. And I was like, and none of those live in the same place? And they're like, no. So it was like, very first thing was we just had to do like a data scrub. We had to bring it all in. We had to do a data health check. There was a ton of duplication.
And how does that vary?
For different pieces of capital equipment, they do have a longer life. I joked a little bit about SPD department, like an autoclave or a sterilizer, a steam sterilizer, definitely has a longer life than an OR table or a stretcher. They're definitely different. But also they have, one is going to provide revenue for a hospital system and one won't. We look at that. We also look at the complexity of a piece of capital equipment. Was this something that we can make a difference in today? And then we look at factors like, was this part specifically of like critical care? Is this something that you're going to need? It's going to see a lot of use in your ER or where you're going to see the majority of your patients. We factor all that in.
How common do you think the challenges that you just described with that organization, how common are they?
99.9% of health systems I come across are in the contingency purchase camp. They're like, this is where I'm at.
What do you think it is about capital equipment that adds to the complexity of understanding what that full cost of ownership really looks like.
With capital equipment, it's just so highly configurable. It's got all those different factors in it. You do have to look at all that. A glove is a glove. You're only going to be able to get it so many different ways. Biogel, latex, free, latex, powdered, non-powdered. There's a couple of different variances, but you can configure the same anesthesia machine 9, 10, 15 different ways across a couple of different health institutions. So it's important that you look at all the different factors. And here's the other piece. As AI is introduced, as we are trying to integrate our hospital system into its capital equipment or just its equipment in general, these pieces of equipment are going to get more sophisticated. There are OR tables, there are stretchers, there are endoscopy towers that report back to their motherships. We've been used this many times. We've been broken. And as the equipment gets more sophisticated, so will the need to look at the TCO of the equipment, because it's just going to get smarter.
That's a new thing, I think, that we're looking at across the board. You wouldn't want to think about how security impacts the use of an imaging diagnostic piece of equipment, but I guess you do now.
We had a bunch of cyber breaches in 2024 and 2023 specifically. That's why there's a lot of healthcare institutions started standing up a cybersecurity program for this equipment. That vulnerability to patient records is ever growing with technology being associated with these pieces of capital equipment.
That adds a whole new layer of complexity. So, Danny, can we quickly just touch on a couple of terms that get thrown around when we're talking about capital equipment and capital equipment solutions? I just want to make sure our audience has a superb understanding after they listen to our episode today about how the asset management component and the strategic sourcing component are different and how each one of these plays into that total cost picture.
So I think whenever you look at asset management, you're really looking at the data of a piece of equipment, how to utilize that data in which to forecast and plan for your capital equipment. Whenever you're looking at the strategic sourcing part of that, you're looking at some of the non-data components, like we were talking about, like the labor. You're not going to be able to pull that out of a machine. So that's kind of the capital strategic sourcing piece, is working more with the clinicians, working with the suppliers to come to a finalized procurement product.
I think that's really helpful.
Yep.
So, Danny, as we're closing out our conversation, what do you think we could offer in terms of a takeaway to our healthcare leaders who want to embed total cost of ownership into their strategy today?
The first thing that I would ask is, do we have the appropriate resources to go deeper into our capital procurement process? Do we even have the resources to do that? This discussion, we've talked about knowing the market, knowing the supplier community, knowing your data, knowing what all is associated with a piece of equipment, understanding what forecasting means both with technology and finances of your own system as well as systems around you. So do you have somebody that can do that with every single piece of equipment that you have and all the different categories? Do you got it? If you don't, why? And if you don't have it, then you're probably only going an inch deep and a mile wide into this landscape. You need somebody that's able to go further in depth. Perhaps you're not doing this efficiently on your own if you're not able to go in depth, or perhaps you're just not resourced appropriately in that space. Well, there are people out there, not saying anybody specifically, but they may have a team. They may have
capital equipment solutions by chance.
They might have proven themselves in the marketplace to do such a thing. But yeah, I mean, you need the help in that space because there's a ton of money that you're leaving on the table, 100%.
Well, Danny, thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us today. We learned a lot, and we look forward to continuing this conversation soon.
Thanks, Susan, for having me.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Capital Compass today. Be sure to subscribe and check out our latest content at Vizient to stay informed on capital strategies, trends, and tools.